The iconic anti-Santa Claus, the Grinch, of course, as many people know, started life as the rhyming Dr. Seuss book, but its adaptation in films and shows have largely helped and cemented its popularity in being a yearly retelling for many households. It's thanks to these adaptations that have contributed to the Grinch's mythology. The Grinch in the original book had no fur colour to begin with, an asset that was formally introduced in the Chuck Jones Christmas special. Today's subject is the Grinch's first silver screening movie, the Jim Carrey version, if you will. Alongside the first two Home Alone movies, it's amongst the highest grossing holiday films. But unlike the Home Alone series, the Grinch is unique as possibly being one of the only live-action fantasy Christmas films of its type. I personally share a long-term history of this movie, being amongst many of the holiday titles that me and my brother would watch year-round, despite not even being the holidays. But since my teen years, I've had a desire to talk about this movie at great depth in a review format. But just as a little disclaimer before I get this movie off my chest, I don't plan to compare this movie to any prior adaptations. After all, comparing a movie to a book or TV special are not at all within the same medium. So I think it's a little bit unfair to compare either projects to the other product standards. But the 2018 animated remake is in a much more fair ballpark, but I haven't seen that movie yet, so I can't say much on that front. But at the end of the day, any project should be able to stand alone and be judged for what it is and its own merits. So enough of the context, let's dive in. Undoubtedly, the best aspect of the whole film is the production expense. The Grinch was one of the earliest films my family had on the DVD format, thus being a curious lad exploring the bonus features, introducing me to the amount of hard work it would take for making a project on this scale, educating me on the makeup artist Rick Baker, and just how tedious the makeup appliance could be, and rightfully won that Oscar for the Grinch's makeup. The film over the years has earned quite a bit of backlash on the Who's looking creepy and yeah, I can see where they're coming from, but to be fair to Rick Baker, if the actors looked any more like the illustrations, then they would have harped near towards looking like the Grinch. And looking at the other makeup tests for the Who's, I personally think that less appliance with the Who's was more appealing in the end. Although I think it was a very wise move for the kid Who's, not having the distinctive noses, to make Cindy Lou Who seem ever more endearing. Jim Carrey as the Grinch, while I do wish he could act more reserved for some of the more subtler moments rather than just being, well, Jim Carrey.
And I care! What is the deal?
But undeniably, he's a hoot to watch. He's one of the few actors in Hollywood that's able to bleed so much of his performance through the heavy makeup. It seems like he outlived a lot of his takes and yeah, I can't lie, I found him pretty hilarious. Although for Jim Carrey, all that makeup was absolute torture. He describes the experience of feeling like that he was being buried alive and had to personally be trained just to bear through it.
It was horrifying. Wow. It was horrifying. It was just like, it's for the kids, it's for the kids, it's for the kids.
While it is rather unfortunate that Jim Carrey had to go through that, there's no avoidance of his problematic behaviour. He was reportedly a nightmare to work with, often wandering off for long periods at a time, and having a go and ripping into everybody when he came back on set. I can certainly empathise of him not having a good time under the makeup, but if you're being a nuisance on set, then, well, you're kind of being a douche on set.
Kiss it, Who Bill!
Another aspect that I found enlightening as a wee lad were the elaborate sets. The set designers couldn't go down to a store and buy some of the unique vehicles seen in the film, they had to make them from scratch, with the book only given vague indications of what a Who world full of appliances would look like. And most important for the channel, it was the first movie where I found out that deleted scenes were a thing, which eventually would lead down to discovering more movie deleted scenes, as well as the lost media variety that were not accessible to the public, which of course is what this channel is mainly dedicated towards, lost media. The Grinch movie does have a few unreleased scenes, but hey, that's for a future lost media video, let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'm just here to do a review. A common critique on the film is that it feels flabbergasted, padded, and unfulfilling, and I do certainly see where they're coming from. But to give the film credit, it does have a clear three-act structure. The essential characters do have a backstory, we know where they come from. Act 2, it looks like the Grinch may be accepted back into society before things take a turn for the worse, as he's pushed over the edge. And we're at our lowest point with the characters, with the Who's feeling attacked, and the Grinch acting on his vengeance. Then in Act 3, everything's nicely wrapped up. No pun intended. We get the moral of the story, the characters make up, everybody lives happily ever after, etc, etc. But even I've got to confess that the journey between each act, I don't personally think were executed in the best manner. The backstory was an exceptional expansion on the original tale. After all, in the original book there was no origin story to speak of, so the filmmakers easily had free range on telling whatever story they wanted. But the Grinch and established main Who characters of the backstory don't really get a chance to interact, nor play off one another for the rest of the runtime. Martha May and the Grinch barely have any chemistry.
Hello, Martha.
We don't get a chance to see any real spark between them before they get together at the end of the film. For a subplot in a family film, I'm not expecting anything like Mr. Darcy, but just a scene on demonstrating of what they see within one another would have gone a long way. I am aware that there is a deleted scene where the Grinch offers Martha a present, but it plays off more comedically for the Grinch's expense.
That's my watch. Oh, so all of a sudden everything on your wrist belongs to you?
And you've got to do a lot of imagination just to make the scene work romantically. Mayor Augustus does fare better. As a character, while he has little screen time with the Grinch, he is actively talking down on the Grinch, embarrassing him over the gift at the Cheermeister. It at least feels like he's more active within the story, rather than Martha that doesn't really contribute too much. But there are even characters that get completely forgotten about, like the Grinch's parents. Aside from If You Blink You'll Miss It Cheermeister cameo, we don't probably get to see them again throughout the rest of the film.
Are you two still living?
They're set up and introduced, but we don't get a payoff with them and the Grinch. With Cindy Lou Who the only one that's actively interacting with the Grinch throughout the film, she gets the right amount of screen time in terms for what their relationship are, but since she's pretty much out of the circle in terms of the other Who characters, it doesn't necessarily give their friendship much weight. Just take this for an example. Let's say they rework the character relationships, where Cindy's parents are Martha May and Mayor Augustus, with her dad now the mayor. It would put a little bit of a dynamic between the friendship of the Grinch and Cindy, like how Luke Skywalker initially learns that Darth Vader killed his father, while both characters don't get a chance to directly interact not until the sequel. It adds history and a bit of venom between the two of them, and some formal dynamic before they met. If you took out the bit of Luke falsely believing that Darth Vader killed his father and the death of Obi-Wan, then Darth Vader is just some generic baddie that Luke doesn't really have a hook on. As for the Grinch, yeah, you've got a bit of history between the characters, but you're just lacking that venom, and the middle person stuck between both worlds that can add a little bit of drama. That's at least one idea how the filmmakers could have got around the Grinch's isolation and still retaining one active character relationship. Not only that, but since the Grinch is devoidedly on his own for the majority of his film, and Cindy Lou Who is the only Who that's actively participating in moving the plot forward, thus there's nothing really that's going on. The Grinch isn't planning an evil scheme, nothing even alluding to him stealing Christmas, not really until before he does it. The mayor is practically not taking any notice of the Grinch or planning to permanently get rid of him. And while the Cheermeister isn't a bad holdover, until the third act, it's not really introduced until midway through the story. There's no goal or endgame for the characters. And with so much of the faffing in the Grinch's cave, it distracts the focus from the Cheermeister plot. Yeah, I still find it pretty amusing with Jim Carrey trying out all the costumes, but it's more subtracting from the story rather than adding to it, with no main focus. And if you're not dazzled by Jim Carrey's performance, it feels a rather hollow experience. During the development of the story, the director Ron Howard hired on storyboard artists that came from the animation and cartoon background, coming up with all sorts of gags as a way to maintain the nature of the Dr. Seuss books. And while that's certainly admirable, what we're left with is a film with no focus not until it's way too late. It's a common critique on many Dr. Seuss adaptations, as they need to be so expanded, with the same reviewers suggesting that it's not ideal adapting Dr. Seuss books. But it is possible to adapt a children's book with either 20 to 60 pages and make that into a decent flick. A prime example of another children's adaptation starring a green monster, released only a few months later, is Shrek. The book as well was very paper thin for that movie, but it took the story, expanded upon it, and while perhaps it wasn't the most direct or faithful version like The Grinch tried to be, it succeeded in just telling its own story and doing its own thing. The Grinch movie just waited for the plot of the book just to begin. It just needed more of a prime focus and introducing one or two more elements into the story just to make it feel more solid. Despite its flaws, there's still a lot to admire from the movie, and enough to keep me coming back. The best way to describe it, it was at least a first good attempt on directly adapting a Dr. Seuss book for the big screen. And that's what the film is. Good. So there you go, that was my thoughts on the Jim Carrey Grinch. Agree or disagree? Let me know in the comments. And if you like what you've seen, then be sure to subscribe. If you've got a little bit of spare cash and if you'd like to donate, then support me on Patreon and you can get some cool perks.